Hey, it's Yay for Yarn, and today I'm going to show you how to knit a tucked stockinette stitch on your Addi Knitting Machine. So this is what this stitch looks like. I'm not aware of any equivalent stitch in hand knitting. If you know what the equivalent stitch in hand knitting would be called, then let me know down below. But this is just a tucked version of the regular stockinette stitch. And what that means is that we are basically intentionally creating tucked stitches in kind of a checkerboard fashion. And it creates a stockinette look stitch. It's not exactly the same, but at first glance it looks like stockinette, but when you stretch it, it has all of these little crisscrossing strands of yarn that go in between. And it creates a very stretchy, very lofty, airy type of fabric that's actually a bit stretchier than regular stockinette. And if we turn this over to the back kind of does resemble a honeycomb type of texture. It kind of vaguely resembles the honeycomb brioche stitch, but it's not. So this is what the back of it looks like. Again, it's very, very stretchy. And this fabric, the change that we make to create this fabric is done entirely on the machine. So we don't have to do anything after we take it off the machine. So now that you have an idea of what kind of stitch that we're making, now I will show you how I did it. And I have the Addi Pro here. You can absolutely do this on the Addi King, you can absolutely do this in the round, or if you have another brand of similar circular knitting machine, you can totally do this on that too. So the one thing you're going to need for this project or for this stitch is a Loom Pick, okay? Now yes, this is necessary. Alright, so the reason we need one of these is because we are intentionally tucking the stitches, and we need to be constantly getting up under there in each of the needles to tuck the stitches. And so we need a Loom Pick to be able to do that. Now some of the newer Addis come with a Loom Pick. So if you have one of those and it came with one, don't worry about getting another one. But if you have the older models or if you have a different brand, I got mine at Hobby Lobby for like $2 or less. They're really cheap. So we're going to use this to create our tucked stitches, which makes our fabric our tuck stitch fabric. So let's talk for a second about how I have it set up right now. I'm working in flat panel mode, and I have a long tail cast on all of my white needles, and I have knit one row of stitches. Now if you don't know how to do a long tail cast on your Addi, I do have a video on that. See the link in the description box. But all I have here is a long tail cast on and the first row of knitting. So I'm going to start by bringing my first few needles down so that they start to catch the yarn. And if you notice, I'm going to turn the machine up a little bit so you can try to see this better. If you notice, the previous stitch sits right here at the base of the needle, and it stays there until the hook of that needle brings the yarn down through it. Okay, so that's a regular stitch. A tucked stitch happens when the previous stitch from the previous row gets slipped up into the hook of the needle. And normally if that happens by accident, we don't want that. But in this case, we are doing it on purpose. So all I did was I lifted the stitch from the base of the needle back up into the hook. And so then when that needle goes down, it's taking both the new yarn and the previous stitch down into the machine with it. Okay? So what we're doing here is we are tucking every other stitch on the first row, and then on the second pass, the second row, we're going to tuck the every other stitches. So for example, this is needle 4. I'm going to be tucking 5, 7, 9, and etc. And then when I come back the other way, I will be tucking the ones in between. So here was my second stitch. I tucked this one. I'm not going to tuck this next one. So then I'm going to tuck this one. I'm going to knit this one regularly, tuck the next one, knit this one regularly, tuck the next one, knit this one regularly, and etc. And basically until I get all the way across. Alright, so that was the end of my row. Now, I will say that if you are doing this in the round, then your first black needle, between your first black needle and your last white needle, is going to be where you switch between alternating the different, which stitches you're tucking. So for example, if this was my first round and I was doing this in the round, maybe I would tuck number 1, number 3, number 5, number 7, number 9, and etc. Then maybe I get back around here and start the next round. Then I would just knit number 1 and I would tuck 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, etc. all the way around. And then this little red tab between the last white needle and the first black needle would be basically our marker of, okay, here's where we're going to switch between alternating the two. So since I'm going back and forth in rows, I'm now going to turn around and go this way. And this one was an odd numbered needle. I tucked this one on the previous row. And you can see the ones that have been tucked do not have this extra strand of yarn sitting around these two red pins. So this was one that was tucked. It does not have the extra strand of yarn sitting there. And if we can look a little closer, this one that just came up, as each one that was tucked comes up, it now has 2 strands around the bottom of the needle. So I'm going to be tucking this edge stitch, skip this one because it was already tucked. I'm going to tuck the next one, skip this one, tuck the next one, skip this one, tuck the next one, and you can see how this stitch that was already tucked has that double strand of yarn around the bottom. So we're basically tucking all of the in-between stitches that were not tucked on the previous row. Now this does take a little bit more time than doing the regular stockinette stitch, as far as you don't just keep cranking as fast as you can until you get the piece the length that you want, because in this case we're manipulating every other stitch. So it does take a little bit longer to knit a stitch like this on your machine, but if you want a loftier, extra stretchy, airy type of fabric, then it might be worth it to you to spend the extra time to create this type of fabric on your machine. Now I will also mention that because we are tucking every other stitch on every row, alternating back and forth, every time we tuck a stitch, we're basically, every time we tuck the stitches in the rows, we are condensing the equivalent of what would have been 2 rows into 1 row. So this fabric, even though it is very light and airy and fluffy, or extra stretchy or lofty, we're basically taking however many rows it would have been to make this twice as long and condensing it here. So this requires twice as much yarn as the regular stockinette. So when you knit this, each 2 rows that we knit with every tucked stitch, every other tucked stitch, that creates the equivalent of what would have been 1 regular row of stockinette. So you will need to work twice as many rows to get to the same length, and it will take twice as much yarn. But if you are going for a texture like this, that is kind of this open honeycomb, slightly woven looking texture, this is technically the wrong side of the work, but this would make a really nice right side of a project, especially if you want to try something a little different than your regular stockinette. And also, this fabric, because it is so airy and lofty, this type of fabric is also more insulating. So if you make this as a winter project, a winter accessory or whatever, this type of fabric is going to, it kind of holds pockets of air, and it helps keep you warmer. And it's still breathable, but it's more insulating because of those pockets of air in between those tucked stitches. So now let's turn and work back the other way. So this first stitch is tucked, so I'm going to begin by tucking the ones in between, which in this particular case is my odd numbered needles. And if you do get the yarn caught a little bit, it is okay to back the machine up just a tiny bit to make sure that that gets caught in the hook correctly. So now we're going to go back the other way and tuck all of the stitches in between that did not get tucked on the previous row. So those are the 2 rows that we're going to be repeating to make our tucked fabric or tucked stitch fabric. Now this is probably the closest thing to brioche knitting that you will get on your Addi if you're only manipulating stitches on the machine. This is the closest you're going to get to brioche. Now it is not the same as regular hand knit brioche, but like I said, it's the closest thing that you're going to get to the feel and stretch and loftiness of brioche as far as manipulating the stitches on your machine. So this stitch is not too hard to work at all, as long as you have the extra time to sit and tuck all of those stitches. This creates a very soft, squishy, stretchy fabric. And I think this would come in handy, especially for hats, because on the larger Addi, some people do not like that the hats it makes can sometimes be a little bit small for a larger adult head. It'll fit a small adult head in most cases, but sometimes it's a little bit small for a average to larger adult head. So if you were to use this tucked stitch instead of the regular stockinette for a hat, it would be quite a bit stretchier, like a lot stretchier. And it does not, it doesn't have like the springy kind of tendency as much. Like it doesn't shrink back. It doesn't take as much force to stretch it, because this stretches really easily. So this would make a great adult size hat on the Addi King because it has a lot of extra stretch to it beyond what regular stockinette has. And also when you stretch this and it is at its stretched in its stretched state, it does kind of resemble ribbing a little bit. So it's kind of like a ribbing look without actually having to be ribbing. So I hope you've enjoyed this video. If you liked it, please give it a thumbs up. If you use this stitch in a project, let me know how it turns out for you in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe, making sure you click the little bell next to the subscribe button to be notified of new videos. Thanks for watching.